A very good day to all our viewers and welcome to another webinar of our Fair AI Thought Leader Speak series. We have with us today Dr. Anand Rao, partner and global artificial intelligence lead at management consulting firm PricewaterhouseCoopers. And we will talk to him about PwC's work in the space of artificial intelligence and their AI toolkit specifically that he and his team have developed. Welcome to the show, sir.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, Dr. Anand, tell us a bit about the AI research that is being done at PwC and more specifically on your AI toolkit.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah. So we have been on this journey of responsible AI, how to deliver AI in a responsible manner, fair, transparent, explainable, robust, all of those attributes that AI should have. And this work literally started 4 years back when we formed an international group of around 8 countries, more than 40 people, bringing together the expertise from the different territories, Europe, Asia, US, and the larger Americas. The purpose of this was essentially to look at what some of the risks of AI are. Of course, people have looked at the opportunities that AI brings, and we ourselves have looked at that before this. And AI is going to have a fundamental impact in almost every sector, every functional area, what they call the general purpose technology. While the opportunities of AI were well known, people were not taking into account all the risks of AI. Having been in the industry for 30, 35 years, we felt that it was very essential for us to balance it out, to understand the opportunities, but also to understand the risks so that we can mitigate those risks. As a firm, we are all about making sure that we exploit the opportunities while mitigating the risks. So that's how we started. We started from a very different angle of let's look at both sides of the coin and then make sure that we get a blended view. And that's what started this research on responsible AI. And the toolkit was a result of that. And it is actually at 3 levels we are addressing the notion of risks. One is at a consumer end as they consume AI and as they use AI, what are the things that we should be concerned about? And then the next level is at the company level. As companies develop these products for consumers and for other enterprises, what should they be concerned about? And at the third level, it's very much at the government and policy making as to what they can do to bring in more AI and to do AI responsibly at the governmental levels. So those 3 levels is what the toolkit looks at.
I understand. So how can companies gain from this toolkit? What are the short-term and the long-term advantages for the companies in question?
Yeah. So the companies, especially the ones who have been adopting and using AI, and then the ones who intend to use, are very much in the phase where they know that there are certain risks, but they really don't understand the full impact of all of the things that they do on the society, on their consumers, right? So again, these things are being built by data scientists, and they are very much focused on getting the technical aspects right, getting the functionality right, and they're not necessarily the ones who are thinking more broadly about the societal impact, although they should, but that's not been their main task so far. So what has happened over the past few years is there are a number of people who are much broader than the data science have been looking at what are some of the issues related with use of AI, adoption of AI, and how do we do that from an ethics perspective, from a regulation perspective, and from a broader broader governance perspective. So when we pick companies, the companies are essentially having two big issues. So one is they're not quite sure what does all this ethics mean in the AI perspective, right? So not all organizations have ethics, and yes, they have right governance processes, but they generally don't talk about ethics. And AI ethics has become a major thing. So what are some of the principles that they should adopt when they release AI systems more broadly across their customers and across their consumers or enterprises? So that's one issue that they have. What do we really mean by ethics? It all seems very fluffy. Is there something concrete here as an organization that we need to do? The second issue becomes much more implementation oriented. How do I make sure that the algorithm that I've got for doing XYZ, here it could be granting a loan for an individual, or doing an X-ray scan using automated techniques? What does being fair mean? What does being explainable? How do we want to explain it? How do we make sure that things don't get hacked into? So much more of the day-to-day concerns around the use of AI are the sort of the two things our clients are grappling with. So the benefit for our corporate customers is, how do you take the concept of AI and make sure that there are very specific principles that come out of it? And how do you adopt and adapt those principles within your organization? So that spans the entire organization, not just your data science department. And then as it flows through from the senior management to the business users, business sponsors, and then to the data scientists, what are the specific things that each one should be looking for when they are building and deploying AI solutions in a human-centered way? So those are the things that they gain, both from a ethics perspective, how do we implement those, to at an implementation level, how do we release some of these AI in a way that's useful for everyone and is responsible?
So since we are on the topic of companies, and you would have engaged with a number of companies in this context, so in your view, while a lot of companies have started to talk and acknowledge the impact of AI and automation and new technologies, how many companies are really doing enough to benefit from the opportunities and address the risks to business as usual when it comes to this entire ecosystem of AI and automation?
Yeah, very good question. So again, AI, even though it has been around for 60 plus years, the industrial and the enterprise adoption is fairly recent. When I say fairly recent, I would say a couple of decades, right? So if you take the technology companies, they started using AI in the 2000s, it started becoming more prevalent, and it's only over the past half a dozen years that it is going beyond the technology companies into the mainstream sectors like financial services, healthcare, manufacturing, and so on. So we see different waves of adoption of AI. So to answer your question, first and foremost, the tech companies are the ones who were essentially promoting AI. Obviously, they are the most heavy users of AI. Media, technology, and to some extent telecommunications. I would say media and technology companies are probably more at the leading edge. Then you have the second wave of adopters. They tend to be primarily financial services, banks, insurance companies, investment banks, and so on, as well as healthcare companies. So healthcare, again, it's a big sector. So again, things are coming there. So that's sort of the second wave, if you like. And the third wave is very much manufacturing, industrial products, retail, oil and gas, some of the more traditional industries, including agriculture, for example. Even agriculture is not immune from the use of AI. So that's sort of almost the third wave. So we see these things coming in waves. And I would say of all of these, the sector that has been most conducive to accepting some of these principles has been the financial services. Why financial services? Because they are a very heavily regulated industry, as we know, across the globe. And because they have been regulated, they have the right systems, processes, governance around some of these issues. So in the financial services world, there have always been model risk, right? So they develop models for market risk, credit risk, all the things that you see in the market. They have developed models, and governments oversee those models. As a result, they have set up a right organization and the right techniques and governance to do that type of checking, validation, testing, and so on. That's happening at the market risk, credit risk. So now when you come up with AI, they are different, but not too different, right? So there are different types of machine learning models. So they are essentially expanding what they're already doing into a broader class of models. So all of the things that we talk about in our responsible AI toolkit, they've been the ones who have been the first ones to show signs of adopting. So they're essentially expanding their role and adopting. So that's the first industry that's benefiting, if you like, from all this responsible AI. The second area that we are seeing quite a lot of adoption, or at least conversations, are the technology companies. As we know now more than any time else, right? So with COVID-19, everything is going online, and even before, people have been very much on the online space, and content has been a big thing. So people are looking at, the technology companies are looking at, how do we make sure that the content is fair? How do we make sure that the content is correct? And of course, some of these networks have millions and hundreds of millions and billions of users. So how do we make sure in that large volume that what we are saying is in fact correct? And what is it that we can do so that people don't misinterpret what we are saying? So those are the sort of the second area where we are seeing more people look at responsible AI. And then manufacturing, the concerns tend to be somewhat different. They don't deal as much with people as machinery. So they are concerned much more about safety of their systems, whether they are robotic systems or AI systems. They just want to make sure that they don't malfunction in ways that they are not used to. So safety becomes an important criteria.
Okay, so in fact, it's interesting that you mentioned agriculture, because in fact, in emerging markets like India and even some in Africa, automation in agriculture has taken off in a big way to take impact to scale. So a lot of interesting examples, but focusing on examples, are there any examples of companies that you could share from your experiences from these particular sectors that you have spoken about, who have been using automation and AI in a responsible, ethical manner?
Yeah, I'm going to be able to give specific examples of companies, but I'll just take a couple of examples here. So I'll give you one example where one of the large technology companies basically took it upon themselves to create a chief ethics officer at the C-level. And what did that person do? So their brief is, now the technology of the company is being used all over the world with a number of people. So they wanted to understand what they need to do in terms of ethics. Now, just in the past 3 years, there are more than 80 plus organizations, 80 organizations talking about AI ethics and all the principles around transparency, explainability, fairness, and so on. There are all of these principles that people are talking about. there are all of these organizations or associations, I should say, publishing various kinds of guidelines. These guidelines may be slightly different, so they all go from a core set of principles. IEEE, one of the professional organizations, as released as a big compendium on ethically aligned design. But every organization, association, if you like, has a slight variation of some of those principles. They had more things which are of concern to them. So there's a wide body of work. So if you are sitting in a company, you're wondering, what do I do with this 80 plus organizations principle? So what we have done as part of the Responsible AI Toolkit is essentially applied AI on all of the documents and extracted all the principles. And we have aligned all those principles and saying which documents are talking about which principles. Now, organizations like the one that I mentioned is looking at this entire body of work and saying what, as a company, we should adopt as AI ethics. Right up to the board level, the C-suite board level, they are adopting some of these ethics principles. But then the next stage starts. So we have adopted the principles. How do we make sure that we are imparting that to the entire organization, communicating to the external consumers as to what they are doing, but also within the organization, there are various governance groups now being set up to essentially monitor and review. So basically bringing it into the way they do their business. So this is just one example of people starting from the high level, but then going down from the principles to policies within the organization. From policies, they go into procedures, and from those procedures, which are step-by-step activities, they come up with activities, and then they assign risks and then controls to it. And as a firm, we look at all of these things and say, how comprehensive is it? Are you testing those controls? So can we now have a more granular argument? So you're not talking about, is your organization fair? What does that really mean? Now you're going into, have you done steps X, Y, Z? Did you take into account ABC? Right? So it becomes much more concrete. So that's what we are doing. And I think more organizations will start doing this.
And in this process of interacting with these organizations, what has been the element of resistance you may have faced? Because, for example, a lot of companies have this inbuilt resistance to new concepts, especially digital concepts, technology-related concepts. So how was that resistance element when you started interacting with these companies on this topic?
Yeah. So it's an interesting duality here, right? So you go to the technology companies. Obviously, everyone is sort of very digital, technology oriented, where it's sort of more driven by technology and hard science, right? So data science, hard science. All the time we are dealing with numbers and formulas and sort of sophisticated technology. And for those people to then say, what is ethics? They say, ethics is all very fluffy. You can't do anything with it. Why are you bothering me with ethics? I'm here to develop a technique, a model, and then make something useful to my consumer. So that's the way they look at it. So that's been the biggest challenge as to how ethics plays a role in any of these things. Now, that challenge is where I think we need to broaden the education, not just of the technologists, but at the same time, at the other side, the businesses or the management side of it, the ethics side of it, don't quite understand how some of these technologies are actually implemented at the end of the day. So in that sense, there is a disconnect between people who are thinking about ethics and people who are thinking about digital. and technology and data science and so on. So one of the key learnings and challenges, I should say, is translating this ethical principles, which are at a very high level, down to something that the technologists can use or the data scientists can use. So it's almost bridging that chasm so that people understand, I understand we need to be fair. I'm not questioning that we need to be fair or we need to be explainable, but tell me what exactly should I do today? When I build my model, what more do you want me to do? So I think that's the thing about the Responsible AI Toolkit. The beauty of the Responsible AI Toolkit is bridging that gap from the high level principles, regulation, and governance, which tends to be very high level, down to, hey, what do I need to do for fairness, for explainability, for security, for robustness, explainability? All of those are very, very tangible things that we are giving. And then bridging that gap, we are hoping that people can see the broader picture as data scientists, and same with ethics, can see how their principles don't say just as principles, but are translated into something that's concrete that people can see.
So in fact, speaking on the impact of AI on work functions, if I might distribute work functions into two pieces, one is the process-based routine functions that exist in any organization, and the other is the more innovative thinking sort of functions where people have to think of the next breakthrough idea. Logically speaking, automation would have impacted the former more than the latter. These days, you do hear examples of automation being used even in thinking sort of functions. So in your view, in your experiences, going forward, would AI and automation per se impact both these work functions simultaneously, or it will still be one more than the other?
Yeah, they're very good questions. The way we think about it is we call it the 4 waves of digital, right? So which touches very much upon what you just said. I think most of the world over the past 20 years, at least since the internet era, we have been digitizing everything, right? So at the top level, we see digitization of all, both online, offline, everything is being digitized. Asset-based industries, information-based industries, everything is turned into data. So that led to the big data revolution, right? So that was the first digitization, and big data was the first wave. Now, with lots of data, we see companies have moved in 2 directions, right? So in one direction, with lots of data, you start standardizing things. When you start standardizing, you can simplify it. When you simplify, you say, I can automate it, right? So that is what we call it as the automation path. And that automation path has focused very much around cost saving, productivity improvement, right? So if I'm doing it for 10 hours, can I do it in 1 hour, right? So can I get all these technologies, natural language processing, robotic process automation, to cut down the time that I'm doing it? But it's, as you said, very mundane, routine tasks that we have been doing. Let's cut down that time. So, for example, in PwC or in any audit firm, there are a lot of documents that we need to go understand and extract useful information from these documents. Earlier, people used to do that by literally reading the document and then typing in the Excel, or cutting and pasting from a document into an Excel spreadsheet so that you can start doing the calculations. Now we are using AI to extract all of those. So we have trained our models, which can go into regulatory documents, which can go into various management reports or tax reports, and then extract very specific information. So that's one way of reducing the time it takes to do things, automating some of those mundane. So that's one part. Just because we have a lot of data doesn't mean that we necessarily have to go and standardize. What people have also been doing is personalizing that data. So we know about a number of examples, whether it's your video or the movie that you are seeing or the song that you are hearing or the book that you are buying. All of those we have tried to personalize very specifically for you versus me and so on. We have very specific personalization. With personalization, we call it cognification. So it's a term from Kevin Kelly from Wired. The cognification is humans have an expertise, especially in the enterprise world. There's very specific expertise of physicians, of financial experts and advisors, right? So, and their knowledge is now being cognified in these AI software to make better decisions. So the best financial advisors' wisdom and the knowledge and the way they do it, he or she does it, is now encapsulated in this advisor, right? So digital advisor, robotic advisor. So that's what we call as cognification, that helps make better decisions. And that is the analytic path or the decision-making path. And we see AI essentially being used in both of these paths, whether it's an automation path or an analytics for better decision-making path at the tail end of it. So we see all of these connected. So the first wave was the data and the digitization wave. The second and third waves are the automation wave and the analytics wave. And then following on from there is the AI wave, right? So all four are going hand in hand. And we are definitely seeing AI being applied to the automation side. We're also seeing AI being applied to the decision making. So let me give you another example on the decision making side. Typically, strategy problems are considered very human-centered, very difficult to do, right? So all the management consultants, strategy consultants, and academic people think of that as a very human activity. What we have been doing is taking that very human-centered activity and using AI to gamify strategy. If I'm entering into a new market and in that new market, I'm introducing a new product, new customer behavior I don't know, you can simulate all of that. Just as we have heard about SimCity, for example, but doing a SimCity for your own business, for your own product. And that's the kind of thing which executives can then try out their strategies in that simulated world and gain that knowledge as to how will consumers behave, how they won't behave. And then now if you couple that with the actual data that is coming in, you have almost a live way of trying out your simulation, trying it out in the external world, getting that feedback and modifying your model. We see the decision making, just as transactional systems are becoming 24/7, in the future, we'll have these decisions also becoming 24/7 as to how executives make decisions. Strategic decisions will also become this way. Again, we are still in the early days of it, and that's something that we see progressing more and more.
But that's a very interesting point you're saying, basically automated strategy decisions. So is this entire concept still in the works, or is it actually implemented in some of the countries?
It's very much implemented. So we have done a number of client work. It works very well in areas where you don't know the market. For example, autonomous vehicles. What will be the market for autonomous vehicles? Who will be buying this autonomous vehicle, or who will be driving or traveling by autonomous vehicles? You can simulate all of that. It's a sort of a digital twin technology of understanding the consumer. So digital twin can embody an asset like a machine or an autonomous vehicle. It can also capture the decision making of consumers. So when would I hail a robo cab? under what conditions will I go? All of those things are being taken into account. What is interesting about this approach is obviously we are all living in a COVID-19 world, everyone almost. And in that sense, everything that we know about the past may not be all that relevant now. So people are struggling with what is the next thing going to look like. No one knows, but that's where this type of a digital twin simulation starts making sense. So we have started using it very extensively even over the past 6 weeks since the COVID-19 hit, because we don't know what the future would be. Would the demand increase for certain things after we get back, or would it be depressed? Airline industry or a hotel industry, or even some of the things that people normally do might change forever, right? So what is that behavior change? We may not know the answer, but we can simulate and look for patterns of what this happens. So this is something, it's very exciting to see that all the things that we did in AI is coming to fruition, and coming to fruition in a much more compressed way because of the speed at which we need to do and handle this crisis. Things are all happening at a warp speed, if you like, compared to the way AI was being adopted earlier.
But this particular strategy automation tool, this is also part of your AI toolkit, or it's a different?
Yes. So it is part of what we call as dynamic and resilient strategy, right? Okay. So dynamic in the sense that it's sort of continuously changing. So you start with multiple hypotheses, multiple theories on how you think the world will evolve, and then you implement your strategy based on how the results come. You're changing it, right? So that's the dynamic part. The resilient part is because you're working with the digital twins, you can try out multiple options. When I say multiple options, it's literally hundreds and thousands of options, not just half a dozen options, which is what the human brain can do with your Excel spreadsheet. In fact, for one of the clients, we simulated more than 200,000 go-to-market scenarios. If you say go-to-market scenario, what can you do with 200,000? Because it was nationwide, and we looked at every city that they were going in for their autonomous vehicles and your car share, ride share. And within each city, there could be a variety of different strategies based on the business model, the advertising, the type of consumers you target, how you price it, how much volume you have in the business. All of those are parameters. By the time you even just do a complete multiple of all of those, you get a huge number of different scenarios. And then you start looking for what are the things that are no regret moves versus big bets. If there's a no regret move, that comes out in when you do these evaluations, that these are things that are valid no matter which world scenario it turns out to be. And there are others which are big bet if it works, and if it happens, then you're going to make a big money, and you can start looking for it and start nudging people or systems towards it. So that way, that's why we mean it resilient. So there are things that you can do which hold good under all situations, and there are certain things which you do for certain situations. We are taking in all the recent advances in AI in gaming, right? So we all know all the work that is being done by a number of different companies going into automating all those games, right? So like Go and a whole variety of those games. So some of the algorithms that are being dealt there is something that we are applying more in a business situation. Of course, the business situation is far more complex than a game like Go, which is one of the most complex games, but the business world, even at its simplest form, is far more complex. So we are trying to address some of those issues within that setting.
In fact, this is very interesting to know that even the strategy officer's job is liable to get impacted by the way automation and AI trends move. In fact, when you were saying your observations, example that came to my mind was that within strategy also, you, for example, you have the people who do the pricing part.
Yes.
An example I once heard when I was, in that region of Southeast Asia, in those cities of Jakarta, Bangkok, Phnom Penh, you have these motorcycle taxis. Ho Chi Minh City have these motorcycle taxis. So typically in the old school days, the person would quote a fare and that's how it would happen. But once these Grab and Gojek companies actually instituted their own services, apparently there was a huge discussion on how they should price it, which takes into factor the traffic situations of that city,
Yes.
which takes into account the all the parameters that play into. But at the same time, it is not much higher than what the old school guys were charging.
That's right.
So how
Yeah.
to balance it out? And apparently there was a huge debate and deliberation on it. I read an article in a newspaper once on that. I recall that right. If I do recall, I'll definitely send. But interesting example. But very quickly, you spoke on COVID. What are maybe the 2 or 3 job functions that you perceive would be most impacted because of this pandemic in our countries?
So what we are seeing, again, I'll take a sector as well as a sort of a functional area. I mean, needless to say, in terms of a sector, the healthcare sector is the one that's been most impacted. Now, as US hopefully gets out of the COVID-19 mode, as sort of the number of cases start coming down, and the deaths start coming down, people are trying to increase the other regular surgeries and hospital visits. So other curves should start coming up, but there is quite a lot of anxiety amongst people, fear amongst people, even if everything is opened up by the governments, the federal and the state governments. It's not clear whether people will actually go to a hospital. And because people are very fearful of whether they'll catch COVID-19 just by going for a visit, and is that really worth it? And in some cases it may be, in some cases it may not be, and they don't know. So one of the things that we are seeing in the healthcare industry and amongst our clients, this whole notion of not so much telemedicine as in everything comes through the wire, where people are also talking about, hey, can we get the healthcare workers to the places more like the old days, home visits, basically have mobile units which can do some of the typical outpatient kind of visits. For outpatient visit, there's no need to bring everyone into the hospital to do an outpatient visit, and people are scared. But if a truck goes across various suburbs in a city and has an appointment and can deal with people from an outpatient perspective, that may be better from all perspectives. From the perspective of the healthcare worker, it works well, right? So they're all in a certain location, and for the people, it works out better as well, right? So there are all these new kinds of models are being looked at, and they can have within that truck, if you like, or a mobile unit, they can have all kinds of test equipment, but they can also have obviously video cameras. Even if the people don't have it, they can go and consult a physician who is probably sitting in his or her home and then consulting, right? So people sitting, and that's something that as people are now getting used to in the non-essential surgery. If you don't really need to touch a person because of surgery, then you could do many of those things remotely. So we are definitely seeing new ways of looking at things, and healthcare obviously being one of those sort of prime areas. Some very exciting stuff. The other thing that we also would see from a functional area is many of the professions which are much more administrative, where you're looking at data, looking at documents, where you don't have that. There's no need, if you like, to have a physical presence. Yes, for social reasons, you may want to be with other people, but from a work perspective, if you really don't need to be physically in the same location, which happens for almost all of the back office functions, mid office functions, that could start happening. And that's where we see, again, technology taking over. Even in the front office functions, I think people will be more comfortable now, are comfortable now, to just have an appointment with your bank manager over any of these online tools, as opposed to necessarily walking into a branch or at a bank, right? So we definitely see on the functional area side, the back office functions definitely doing more of this as a result of COVID-19, and maybe to a larger extent, even the front office functions will start changing.
Which in fact, brings us to a very interesting question of what is the social cost of new technologies, automation. So in your view, what are the 2-3 things companies can do to minimize the social cost, of losses of human jobs, or, to reduce that social cost to some extent?
Yeah. So I think the social cost, especially the economic cost, I think to the extent that people can start getting back to the economy as much as possible by minimizing the contact, I think works out better, right? So some of the things that we are doing, so everything that can be done with remotely, I think we should try and do it remotely, right? So that's the first. But there are certain things where you cannot do certain things remotely, at least the way we are structured now. Let's say manufacturing, if you're making cereal boxes, for example, or whatever other manufacturing you're doing, it happens in a plant, physical location, and then you do need to bring people there physically to operate those machines. Things are not fully automated yet. Maybe we will get to sometime in the future, but now they are not, right? So almost 99% of all of those factories require human intervention. So in that sense, what we are trying to do is, can we do it in a way that sort of respects some of the social distancing? So again, using similar technology for decision making that I mentioned earlier, the simulation technology, we are looking at how do you organize your teams into various cells or teams of people who are required to operate a machinery. And all of them form a team or a cell, and they'll always come together, right? So you won't have teams that are intermingled. You'll have very specific cells. And with those, you're saying, how can I still continue to operate my plant? Why are we doing this? Now, if let's say one person gets infected from that cell, you can basically tell that cell to isolate itself and to go on quarantine, but the other cells are still active. Let's say there are 5 cells, each producing 20% output, and one of them goes down, you still have 80% of the output. So we really need to be thinking around how do we develop level up some of these manufacturing and the demand satisfaction in a very resilient way. And what we're also doing, so that's again done through simulation of the workforce and how we do it, we're also looking at, can we model the infection rates by each of those teams based on the testing. So the testing might happen once a week, once a day, whatever the testing. So whatever frequency, we can try and predict the infection rates for these people in specific locations, right? So New York would be very different to Austin, Texas, or Florida, based on what happened with the disease. So that's a second way where you're trying to monitor the people as they come into the workplace, how infectious they are, and how do you maintain the social distancing. And again, for offices as well as sort of physical locations, we can now do what is called as pedestrian modeling, where you're looking at how people move around. And when, let's say, you have a 1,000 square foot building with 100 people, now in the normal days, that 100 people in 1,000 square foot was probably enough distancing. Now in the COVID-19 world, for the same 1,000 square foot, you may not be able to get 100 people. Now you can calculate what is a safe number. Is it 50? Is it 80? Is it 20? And then start doing those calculations, minimizing the rules. And now we are also looking at how, if you can redesign the space within an office complex, if this is going to last for a couple of years, then how best do you redesign your chairs and desks based on how people interact? There's no point in bringing in people who generally don't interact to cross each other, to do the contact tracing, and all of those is something that, again, the technology is providing those to make it easier for us to go back to work. So that's the other thing that's happening as a result of the COVID-19 is how do you return to work? Not so much, yes, this disease has come, but how do we minimize the losses as we go further?
So any examples of any company or sector you might be able to share who are actually doing some work on this front? On these
so in fact, there's sort of two examples. So one is a retail manufacturing company, so consumer product goods. So they make various consumer products. So they are trying to open up a plant in one of the states, and what they are concerned about is, hey, how do I open up the plant? When I open up the plant, there are three issues at stake here. One is, how much should I produce? That really depends on the product. For some, it has increased. For some, it has decreased. So how much product do I need to produce? Some have essentially, people have been hoarding, so they're not sure for the next 3 months, should we manufacture the same way? Or if people are already hoarding, they may not buy, right? So that's wasted manufacturing. So there's a lot of issues around that. The second one, which we are now helping them with, is how do you design your workforce? So their question is, if I ask my people to come into the plant, will they come? Will all of them come, or will they take paid leave or even unpaid leave, right? So what would be the absenteeism within my plant? Now, what incentives? So once you know what that absenteeism is, again, you don't know it, you can project it and predict it, and then what can you do to make sure that you are getting the trust of the people, right? So you're cleaning the surfaces, you're testing them, you're doing various things and telling them it is a safe environment to come, and also open up in a way that is sort of measured. Get 20% of the people, maybe see how it goes for a week, and then get 20% more, right? So then people feel more confident that, hey, I'm not going to get COVID-19 just because I walk into my office or my factory. So that's something that they are very typically doing as to how do we actually get to work and how do we schedule these things. And of course, there's a supply issue as well. If you have all the people and the demand is there, but if the supply hasn't come, there's no point in keeping your people in the factory. So how do you balance all of those? It's something typically they have not done, right? So the demand has always been there. You run to production, and then you just make sure that obviously the people are there. You just make sure that the supplies are coming just in time, and you're producing, right? So with a very little inventory. Now suddenly all three of them are short. So you don't know what the demand is. You don't know whether you'll get the supply, and you don't know whether there'll be enough people to even produce from the supplies to the demand. So that's one. The other area, of course, is restaurants, right? So again, restaurants have been very highly impacted. And one of the restaurant chains is looking at how many people, when the lockdown opens up, when the restrictions are removed, how many people will actually come in and eat within my restaurant, right? Yeah. And how many people will take out, right? So can we do delivery? So they've typically not done delivery. Now back to the strategic issue. Now they are trying to look at the strategies that they have. So typically we have not done delivery. Now in this situation, if this lasts only for 2 months, we probably don't need to get into the delivery business. But if this is going to go for 2 years, we better have some strategy of partnering with some local logistics group so that we can do delivery. Otherwise, we'll disappear. Right? So again, don't know which one, but you need to sort of sense, maybe have a plan, start planning for maybe in a month or 2 months time, start looking at the partnerships. But while you are opening up your restaurant chain, again, they are in many states across US, so they can see whether people are still coming into Texas or Tennessee or Dakota and so on, so they can start monitoring across the nation and see what the patterns are to make that decision. So that's how we are helping them by looking at the strategic decision. Should I get into delivery and take out, or should I not, right? And what are the consequences either way? No one knows the right answer, but we can do a lot of simulations and say under what conditions would this be better than this, and then start looking for it over the next 2, 4, 6, 8 weeks as these things turn out, and then essentially pivot around it. So this is what we call as a resilient strategy. It's not that, I know what the demand is going to be. It's going to be plus or minus 10%. If I'm really good at my marketing, I can push towards a higher number. No, it doesn't work in this new COVID world. Those things that people generally have as mental models don't work. You need to think about various mental models and then essentially simulate it.
In fact, if should this entire situation continue, probably the other variable that will play in is that a lot of people will go back to old school cooking. So the demand of delivery also may come under a bit of scanner, because a lot of people may, in fact, there may be an opportunity for an automated cooker at your home, where people feel the safest that there is no absolute outside element coming in form of a delivery guy. But
that's a very interesting thing. And one of our clients is definitely asking that. So they are basically making ingredients for home cooking, right? So now their question is, will this, of course, they have seen a demand increase. Their question is, will this demand increase stay if people are enjoying cooking, right? So checking with YouTube, doing all of those things, capturing pictures, sharing it with family. That's a way of bonding in this sort of difficult times. But they're doing that. Will this continue? The sort of the joy of cooking, will more people be cooking at home? Therefore, we need to increase the overall production of these kinds of ingredients, is what they're asking, or will this disappear when everyone goes back to work? Whenever that is, will it all disappear, right? So no one knows, but that's what they are. And can you do something proactive to keep them doing this, right? So can you give them incentives? Can you start sharing some of these recipes? Can you start having cooking lessons on various social media, right? So to stimulate and keep that interest level up, right? So those are all possible, so sort of gentle nudges. And people are very much habit-forming animals. Once you form a habit, then you generally stick with it. It's hard to form a habit, but once you form a habit, you tend to stick with it. And that's one of the things that behavioral economists are looking at as to, hey, if this is a habit forming part and it's good for us as for the environment, for the society, then we should probably continue doing it.
So let's move to a human resource related question. Now, since implementing any form of new technology or digital solution is essentially a cross-functional sort of way of working. So in your experiences working with various companies, how many companies have you actually seen who have put in place a cross-functional CTO, if I can call it that, who is across the functions to implement a particular automation or AI-based solution?
Yeah. So I would say, again, the adoption of AI has followed very much what you said in terms of creating a center of excellence, so cross-functional, cross-business unit center of excellence. So the more you have evolved in that adoption curve, the more you tend to have these kinds of roles. So it might be a chief analytics officer, some call them chief AI officer now, but chief data science officer, data officer. And in some cases, there is no chief officer of some kind, CXO of some kind, but a center of excellence. A center of excellence which reports into the leadership group, right? So what we have tended to do is make sure that the specific analytics, AI things that are being done in the functional areas are coordinated from the center. It really depends on the organizational structure, whether you are much more business unit, functional unit focused, or whether you're more centralized versus decentralized organizations. In the centralized organizations, I've typically tended to have more control at the center of excellence. So typically you have a CDO, CS chief analytics officer of some kind, and they are essentially having a group of people and then seeding each of the business units or functional areas with analytics AI people. They all report into the central group, but they are given, if you like, to the respective business areas where the applications are being developed, the AI is being developed and deployed, right? So that's one mode. In other companies which are much more decentralized, marketing might have a strong AI component, or operations or risk might have strong AI groups, and you have a center of excellence which tries to bring the best of everything into the centralized group, try to create some set of standards by which everyone would operate, making sure that the tools, the techniques, all of those things are organized. So responsible AI toolkit, for example, the governance has been set in place. All of those things are managed, but the actual implementation will happen at the respective functional or business unit levels. Okay. And the skill levels have tended to be sort of, I would say, twofold or threefold. I mean, third one is essentially the business domain knowledge or the functional knowledge that has always been there at the business level. Now, the data scientists are much more in one group, and then we data scientists, machine learning engineers. Then we're also seeing people who can bridge the gap between the business world and the technology, analytics, AI world. They go by different names, but we call them bilinguals or multilinguals. So someone who understands, let's say, marketing, but also understand different techniques that AI can bring in, and they may not be going there and coding and programming, but they know who to go to, what kind of technique to use. So that's what we call as bilinguals and multilinguals. Sometimes you need business domain knowledge, statistical AI knowledge, and also data knowledge or technology knowledge or software development knowledge. So some combination of these is what we are seeing companies do. And it may be difficult to find these people outside, so they have to grow them in-house. So they take people with the right background. So we have done that in our firm as well, and our clients do that. So you take people in the business who have been there for 10, 15, 20 years, but they have the right background in stats and math and so on. So they are much more easier to train on some of these techniques. So they become the bilinguals. And in some cases, the technologies have grown to understand the business, and they want to be more embedded in the business. So there is a path from the more technology and the AI people going into the business. So both of them form the different bilinguals, as we call them. And that's probably the most critical area which companies need. They can go now, I think you can go and hire junior data scientists and AI engineers and ML engineers. So there's more of them coming now. But this group that is bridging the gap between the two, that's a harder group to find. And the challenge is you almost have to grow them internally based on your organization, as opposed to getting someone from outside.
A lot of companies are, in fact, calling it the Business Solutions Group these days, BS Group. So, So, in context of your AI toolkit, so what are the 2-3 major issues within governance, accountability, and transparency that any company that is implementing AI solution should take cognizance of?
Yeah. So a couple of major things that have come up. So one is very much around the notion of bias and fairness. So this tends to be more in the information-oriented industries. When a particular decision is being made, then are we making sure that the algorithm is not giving any biased answer? So now people might wonder, why is this such an issue? Now, the reason why this is such an issue is in normal software development, you as a human programmer are writing the code specifically on what variables to pick, what to do, and how to do it, right? So again, there needs to be controls on it. So there are rules, regulations, and testing, and all of those things that happen there. So that's been there for quite a while now. Now, what happens with machine learning models specifically is that the way the machine learning models work, you are feeding it lots of data, and then based on that data, that machine learning algorithm is finding patterns and then saying what is the right decision. Should I give loan to this person, or should I deny that loan? Now, the challenge that we face is that data that is being fed into this machine learning algorithm is historical data, whatever data we have had. And now, with that historical data, if that historical data is biased in some way, in many cases, they may be, right? So because of historically, we have discriminated against certain groups, certain classes. Now, you are institutionalizing that discrimination within that machine learning model. Not only are you institutionalizing it, back to your earlier point, we are scaling it, we are automating it, we are making it faster and and better, right? So, and it is being also scaled to everyone. As a result, any kind of a unfairness that you had is magnified almost 100-fold or 1,000-fold because of this machine learning, automation, and it feeding the data. So that's why you need to be more careful around this notion of fairness, and you need to go and check what kinds of fairness. There are more than 35 definitions of fairness, mathematical definitions of fairness. Now, if I'm a data scientist, I can't read your 50, 100 papers, all very mathematical, to decide what is the right definition I should use. I need something which is much more tangible, concrete. If I'm doing a credit limit increase decision, I need someone to come and tell me, hey, here are the 5 definitions, and this is how you rate across these 5. I can inspect them and then write my comments on which one makes most sense for the problem that I'm doing. So our Responsible AI Toolkit, for example, does exactly that. So given a certain decision, given the data set that you have, given the algorithm, here are all the definitions, here are the numbers. So it's not telling you whether something is fair or not. So that is a human judgment still. The human has to choose, or the organization has to choose what definition you want to use, but it is doing all of that computation, it is explaining all of that computation, making it easier for humans to operate, so democratizing that notion. So there's just one example of how we are enabling that notion of fairness. And it's not as straightforward as if there are certain prohibited variables, just don't use them. So the thing is, if you don't use those variables, there are other variables that together can indicate ethnicity or can indicate gender. So it's not as simple as just eliminate the protected variables and you should be fine. And that also gets you into a wrong mode. So this is just one example. The other example is explainability, right? So if I'm a customer in a bank and you tell me I don't get my mortgage, and they ask you why didn't I get my mortgage, then you can't say my model told me so, or you can't say your number is 526. We allow mortgages only up to 550 plus, and what does that mean, right? So you need to be able to explain, or the bank manager needs to be able to explain to an end consumer as to why he or she was rejected. And that needs to be an explanation that they can understand. So better explanation might be, what do you need to do so that you can cross 550? You need to have more assets, or I can give you a mortgage, but not for 90% of the equity, 85% of the equity I can give you. So that's a better answer than saying, no, your mortgage has been denied. So how much percentage do I need to go and find? Or if you can furnish some more documentation, then we might be able to consider again, right? So those are some of the explanations that are needed. Now, when we build these algorithms, how do we make sure, what are the ranges of explanation for whom? For an end consumer, that explanation might be more what actions they can take. But if a regulator is coming in, they are looking at it and say, have you discriminated this person against someone else? That's something that they may be, but that might be of concern. For a business sponsor, they don't understand all the details of all the algorithms, or nor do they need to understand every different technique for doing something. They just need to make sure that the right people have reviewed it. The people who built it, the people who tested, they've all done their due diligence, and they've all been doing it the right way. And that's the governance that they are expecting. So the explanation needs to be very different for the different people. And that's what, again, the toolkit says. So try and identify your different stakeholders for your explanation, for each one of them, this is the type of explanation that needs to be there to give assurance, to give some level of confidence or trust in the algorithm.
So, Dr. Rao, very quickly here, one very critical question. Partial automation or full automation? Which one do you think is the future? By partial, I mean partial with some human element in it. Which one realistically speaking is the future?
I would very much go with the partial automation. We call it human in the loop. For a huge number of tasks, almost 90% plus of tasks, it should still be human in the loop. The reason is there are so many things that the technology can do, but it is more the comfort and the trust of the humans on the machines need to come in first. And over time, when the human is just sitting there saying yes, 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 yes to whatever the system is recommending, and they're so bored of doing it, at that point we can say, okay, so you don't have to click on the yes, let it do it itself, right? So, but we haven't reached that for many, many things that we are doing. So the human in the loop, I think, is very, very critical, except for certain areas where the speed at which you need to make those decisions is so, it goes beyond the human decision-making time. That's when you really need to test it appropriately and then implement it as an autonomous decision. Obviously, in autonomous driving, if you have to slam the brake, you can't be asking the user and say, hey, press yes before I brake. So at that point, you need to make the decision autonomously, and then you better be very careful as to how you're making that decision. But in many other cases where time is not a constraint, then I think it should be left to the humans. Again, over time, we'll automate some of the more mundane things, make it more autonomous, and leave more of the strategic things for the human. But that is a process that needs to happen. It cannot be rushed through. And rushing through that process might actually result in the next AI winter if you're not careful, right? So we've gone through a couple of AI winters. We need to be careful that we gain the trust. There's no hurry in doing these things all autonomously. I think we still need to have the human in the loop and learn over a period of time, and then be very, very confident that we are doing the right things and adopting those principles.
So, Dr. Rao, a couple of last questions. We've already taken a lot of your time. One question on the policy and governance side. So you were mentioning on the consumers and the companies when it comes to your toolkit. We've spoken a lot on that. One question on the government side. Now, in the context of most of our countries have a problem of income inequity. Now, with COVID, education happening online, a lot of families who do not have ready access to broadband, laptops, there's an entire element of education inequity that is coming up suddenly over the last few months. Now, in all of this background, do you think somewhere new technologies, considering that new technologies are still very expensive to source, develop, customize, that it may run the risk of deepening the gap between haves and have-nots in a society? And how do the typical politicians or policymakers interpret that? Because from their perspective.
Yeah, no, it's very much happening. So we have all heard about the digital divide, right? So, and I think just as we have the digital divide, as I said, AI is just one more fourth wave of digital. So that's as we call the intelligence divide. So that is also coming in. And what these things are doing is sort of, there are two ways in which it is affecting. It is affecting at a country level. There are certain countries which are adopting these technologies and they're forging ahead faster and farther than countries who are not adopting it. So it's a sort of polarizing countries by the adoption, right? So that's number one. And then if you go into even the countries, there are people who are, as you said, typically typically of a higher socioeconomic class, and they are the ones who are essentially using these technologies, have these technologies, adopting these technologies, and they are moving forward. While at the same countries, there is a greater disparity between the people who have and have not. That inequity is spreading within countries, and it's also spreading across different countries because of the AI technology, digital technology. Now, to answer how you would combat that, that's where we see some of the more international organizations, supranational organizations come in. UN, for example, as the goals, the SDGs, so the Sustainable Development Goals, and as part of that, there are very specific metrics around inequity. And AI researchers have obviously been embracing some of that, and there's an entire group of AI for Good, which essentially is very conscious of how some of these things are happening, and then trying to make sure that these things, we have a formal mechanism of breaking it up and making some of these things available. There are a lot of not-for-profits and larger bodies like the World Economic Forum, for example. They're all raising some of these issues, both at the policy level and then also at a company level and at a citizen level, so that we at least are more conscious when we are developing these things, and we can make it available more broadly across the different segments of the population, countries, or even people within countries. It is a tough issue.
Yeah. So one final question on your AI toolkit. So how can organizations who are interested to use it, understand it, implement something from it, how can they typically make use of it? Do they become your clients? Is there any component is open source, or is there any repository that they can use?
So there is a diagnostic that they can take. So there's a website, there's a Responsible AI website, PwC.com/RAI, Responsible AI site, where they can go take a diagnostic. They'll also find the details of the different modules there, and also a number of papers that have been written on the 5 components of responsible AI. All of that is something that they can get directly by going to the website. And then if they want to have a further conversation, again, there are in the different territories, we have different people who are experts in this area. They can contact them, and then they can have a further conversation where they can start using some of the toolkit that we have built on very specific things. Again, it depends on what they are doing, how they are doing it, what type of people they have. So that would help them adopt that toolkit. So that's how they would get to use some of the responsible AI toolkit.
Right, that's fantastic to hear. Right, Dr. Anand, I thank you for sharing your insights and for giving us your time. It was extremely insightful to know all the details that you were talking about, and I wish you a good day ahead. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. Thank you. Pleasure.